And start recording. Do we have Dr. Heidi Hales and TJ Poor ready to go?
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Okay. So Melissa, why don't you start recording?
It's recording. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. All right. It is 10:50 a.m. on December 21, 2020. This is the meeting of the Vermont Climate Council. We are at the third substantive agenda item, where we are being presented with the inventory of existing programs that impact greenhouse gas emissions. And the presenters today are Dr. Heidi Hales, the Director of Air Quality and Climate Division in the Department of Environmental Conservation. We have TJ Poor, who is the Director of Efficiency and Energy Services in the Vermont Department of Service. So I will turn it over to Heidi. And so please take it away.
Thank you, Secretary Young. So I'll share my screen. Can everyone see my slides? Yes, yeah. Okay, thank you. Yes. So good morning. I'm going to start off today by introducing myself, and then my colleague and co-presenter will introduce himself. So again, I'm Heidi Hales, and I'm the Director of the Air Quality and Climate Division in the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, which is housed within the Agency of Natural Resources. And I have the pleasure of co-presenting today with TJ Poor. TJ?
Hi, I'm TJ Poor. I'm the Director of Efficiency and Energy Resources at the Public Service Department. Folks have forgotten the Public Service Department is charged with representing the public interest in energy, telecom, water, and wastewater utility efforts, and we're also the State Energy Office.
Hey, thanks, TJ. So today's presentation is an overview of existing state programs that impact greenhouse gas emissions. So we're glad to be here with you virtually today, and let's get started. So the outline for today's presentation includes an introduction, some basic definitions, a review of state of Vermont greenhouse gas mitigation actions, a brief discussion on the role of sequestration, and a summary of our conclusions. To begin, Section 591B1A of Act 153 sets forth that the Climate Council shall create an inventory of existing programs that impact greenhouse gas emissions and their efficacy. So today, TJ and I are going to provide an overview of existing state programs that reduce greenhouse gases that are quantified and included in the Vermont greenhouse gas emissions inventory that Peter and Colin just discussed. So please note, we know that this is not a comprehensive list and that additional mitigation work is done by the state of Vermont that is not included here. For example, the Department of Fish and Wildlife is doing great work on wetland restoration, and emissions reductions from these projects are not currently included in this inventory of existing programs. These types of projects will be reviewed more comprehensively in upcoming presentations to the Climate Council. For this presentation, again, we focused on greenhouse gas emissions that are included in the annual greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Today, it is our honor to present current greenhouse gas mitigation projects from across state government, including the Department of Buildings and General Services, the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, the Agency of Natural Resources, Agency of Transportation, the Public Service Department, and the Public Utility Commission. We'd also like to highlight that for today's presentation, greenhouse gas mitigation actions and projects include programs that were both specifically designed to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases and programs that were originally designed to address other state priorities that have the co-benefit of also reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I highlight this since there may be additional opportunities to optimize existing programs to further reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So to recap, our goals for today are to review existing state programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, highlight sectors for further reductions, and discuss some challenges associated with estimating greenhouse gas emission reductions within each sector. Before we dive into the individual sectors, I'd like to review some basic definitions, and some of this will be a repeat from the previous presentation. Just to note that the definition of climate change mitigation is a bit distinct from the definition of mitigation, as you can see here on the slide. Climate change mitigation is focused on human actions that reduce emissions of greenhouse gases or enhance the storage of greenhouse gases. And mitigation measures are specific technologies, processes, or practices that contribute to climate change mitigation. Climate change adaptation and resilience projects will be discussed at the next Climate Council meeting. Moving on to some terminology that TJ and I will be using in this presentation. First, the Vermont Greenhouse Gas Emission Inventory quantifies emissions of greenhouse gases. And for this presentation, again, we're presenting on programs that reduce these quantified emissions. As reviewed in the Vermont Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory report, sequestration by forest is estimated, but it is not currently part of assessing the progress towards the state's greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. The Vermont Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory has been the primary method for tracking Vermont's progress towards meeting its greenhouse gas reduction goals. And TJ is going to introduce our second term.
Right. So in 2015, the General Assembly passed the Renewable Energy Standard, which sets the pace for the amount of electricity consumed in Vermont to be delivered by renewable generation. And throughout the presentation, we're going to use some language that describe the three various tiers of the standard. So when we refer to tiers, this is what we mean. Tier 1 sets the overall renewable requirement for electric distribution utilities. It started requiring 55% of retail sales to be renewable in 2017 and increases to 75% in 2032. Tier 2 requires a portion of that Tier 1 to be met with smaller in-state renewable generation that was built after 2015. That requirement started at 1% in 2017 of retail sales and increases to 10% in 2032. Those tiers aren't additive, so Tier 2 is kind of nested within Tier 1. And then Tier 3 is a little different and new in that it encourages what the statute refers to as energy transformation, requiring electric utilities to reduce fossil fuel consumption by their customers. It takes a lot of different forms, but also it is often included incentives for electrification. We'll get into a little more detail on in the sector discussion on the renewable energy standard.
All right, thanks, TJ. And the third term on this slide, greenhouse gas emission reduction measures in this presentation are divided into two general categories. The first includes primary programs, and the second is supporting programs. Primary programs are measures with quantifiable greenhouse gas emission reductions, and supporting programs simply support the primary greenhouse gas mitigation measure. So keep in mind, these are not necessarily distinct categories, and note that there may be some overlap with these categories and how we're defining them for today's presentation. We'd also like to highlight that currently the impact of individual programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions often can't be separated out and identified within the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. These programs and measures are all important and are one part of the calculation of the emissions for an entire sector. To help illustrate this challenge of specifically quantifying emissions from specific measures, we provide an example of the mitigation measure of electrifying our light-duty fleet of vehicles. So we currently have a combination of primary and supporting actions to support this work, including state regulatory requirements and purchase incentives. However, since the greenhouse gas emissions inventory quantifies overall emissions for the entire transportation sector, it can be challenging to specifically identify the impact of these specific programs within the inventory. However, the emissions reductions are included in the total for the sector generally. Briefly, we'd also like to highlight some additional important considerations when determining mitigation measures that will not be specifically addressed today, such as equity, the amount of greenhouse gas reductions associated with a specific mitigation measure, public health benefits and public health impacts of a measure, cost effectiveness, as well as several other important considerations you can see listed here. So currently, greenhouse gas mitigation measures are an important part of the state's air quality, water quality, transportation, energy, land use, public health, and fleet management work. And again, I really would like to stress this work is done across state government. And today we'll be focusing on work conducted in the Agency of Agriculture, Agency of Human Services, Agency of Natural Resources, Agency of Transportation, and the Public Service Department. So as a bit of a review from the previous presentations, the sectors that are included in our greenhouse gas emissions inventory include transportation, residential, commercial, and I got caught up on this too, residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use, also RCI, agriculture, electricity, industrial processes, waste, and the fossil fuel industry. So within each sector, the state works on a combination of primary and supporting actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And again, before we dive into each sector, it's important to review this graph again of greenhouse gas emissions from 1990 to 2016. This graph shows our current emissions and highlights where we need to go to meet our greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. So now we'll review existing programs that impact greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont, sector by sector, as identified in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So we start off with the transportation sector, which is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont, with almost 45% of the 2016 emissions. This sector includes light duty, medium, and heavy duty vehicles, as well as non-road vehicles. So vehicle type, age, and vehicle miles traveled per year all impact transportation greenhouse gas emissions. Current actions in Vermont to reduce emissions include Vermont's low emission vehicle and zero emission vehicle programs that require cleaner cars in Vermont and light duty vehicle electrification. Some programs that support this work include the extended vehicle warranty coverage and our multi-state ZEV work. Another example in the transportation sector is the state's Volkswagen Environmental Mitigation Trust funding. While the intent of this settlement is to reduce emissions of NOx, of nitrogen oxides, Vermont has also focused funding towards vehicle electrification projects, such as an electric bus pilot, installation of electric vehicle charging stations, other diesel replacement projects with electrification. Continuing with transportation, the state also provides incentives to encourage the purchase of electric vehicles, both light duty and some buses. So just want to stress that while there may be some challenges and questions with incentive programs and whether an individual would have made the same choice without the incentives, we'd like to highlight that incentives do also play a very important education, marketing, and trusted information source for consumers. And briefly, the state provides numerous supporting programs to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sectors. So again, these are programs that support the primary initiatives to reduce transportation emissions. So some of this work includes support for EV charging stations, participation in light duty and heavy duty zero emission vehicle MOUs and action plans with other states, and support for outreach and communication, in addition to other programs on this slide. So as we wrap up the transportation sector, we offer one more example just to highlight some of the complexities with this work. Public transit is an important part of long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies. And historically in Vermont, it's been approached as a public good program and not specifically designed to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. For public transit to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we need to increase ridership on existing routes and also maximize ridership on new routes. So in other words, programs that increase routes, but also maintain low ridership may not necessarily decrease greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, at least until ridership increases. Just however, also replacing existing buses with more efficient buses does result in a net emissions reduction regardless of ridership. So the next largest sector is the RCI, or the residential, commercial, and industrial fuel use sector. And TJ will provide an overview of this sector for us.
Right, thanks, Heidi. So as a reminder, much of the RCI sector is heating, water heating, cooking, with oil and propane emissions as the main contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Heidi just discussed one example and type of complexity with public transit as an example. Another type of complexity in talking about greenhouse gas emissions across sectors is where the lines between traditional fuel uses and the electric sector consumption are increasingly becoming blurred. You know, some of the buildings that tackle buildings and processes affect the RCI sector, the transportation sector, the electric sector. So just again, where they show up in this presentation is a little less important than the holistic program and the overall impact. So with that said, there's several RCI sector emissions mitigation programs that are related to the thermal envelope of buildings. Vermont has one of the oldest building stocks in the country and high usage of oil and propane, and a quarter of the state served by natural gas. So the biggest program on a dollar basis to address emissions from the sector is the Low-Income Weatherization Assistance Program, which is funded by a fuel surcharge and overseen by the Office of Economic Opportunity. This program lies within the Agency of Human Services for a reason. It's not just an energy program, but one that provides important social services to our most vulnerable Vermonters. 2018, the Department of Health issued a Weatherization Plus Health report that quantified the dollar value of the health benefits associated with low-income weatherization, and it was really substantial. So not just an energy program, but it's also our biggest dollar energy program that attacks emissions. In addition to that, there's the state's regulated energy efficiency utilities. It's Efficiency Vermont, Vermont Gas, and Burlington Electric Department deliver programs offering technical assistance and incentives for non-low-income weatherization and commercial and industrial fuel use. Efficiency Vermont and Burlington's budgets, which are directed by the legislature from two electricity-related funding sources, are fairly limited for these purposes, particularly as we go out in time. But for natural gas, the Public Utility Commission recently approved a plan to double gas efficiency investment over the next several years. The efficiency utilities aren't just incentives, they also support and have supported over time a whole lot of information in educational programs. Think the Vermont Energy Education Program, button-up workshops across the state. You've probably seen some of these programs in your town or advertised. As mentioned earlier, Tier 3 of the Renewable Energy Standard, the Energy Transformation Tier. Utilities have often chosen to meet those requirements with measures that increase electric consumption. And so you may be thinking, oh, heat pump incentives, electric vehicle incentives provided by your local utility, and you would be correct. In 2019, about half of the fossil savings from this program were associated with just heat pumps alone. Over 10,000 heat pumps are expected to be installed in 2020. But it's not only those incentives, commercial projects and industrial loads are served as well. For instance, Tier 3 has driven utilities to extend electric service to sugaring operations that were powered by diesel generators, removing that previous fuel use. These were big winners it was a win-win-win for the customer, the utility, and the climate. Get rid of diesel generation. The customer has a stably priced, lower cost fuel source and incentives to lower the cost of the line extension to them. And the utility has additional electric sales when with managed load can help spread the fixed cost of the system across more kilowatt hours and reduce rate pressure. I'll note that there's coordination aspect. The programs are required to be delivered in coordination with efficiency utilities. We want to keep efficiencies in program delivery and make those incentives seamless to customers. Also, I'll mention the Clean Energy Development Fund. Currently, this has evolved to be largely supporting advanced wood heating and other biomass support. Excuse me. The funding for the Clean Energy Development Fund has been decreasing over time, and the program is likely to phase out in the near term because of lack of funding at the moment. Next slide, Heidi. So on to supporting programs. And again, as Heidi mentioned, the line between the primary and supporting programs is blurred, and it's a little less important where exactly it lands than that we're recognizing it. The renewable energy standard, tiers 1 and 2, they're requiring certain portions of the electric sales to be renewable, but that supports the electrification programs that mitigate RCI sector emissions. And we'll talk more about those as a primary measure in the electric sector conversation. Other programs include building energy standards for new buildings and large renovations, that ensuring the best available cost-effective technologies installed, and avoiding lost opportunities to make efficiency investments when the building is being built. The Department of Public Service updates these every 3 years based on a international energy code, but with many Vermont-specific amendments that make our codes some of the leading in the country. And then quickly, the state also has a self-managed energy efficiency program and the opportunity to create energy savings accounts. And this is the large customer self-managed programs, helps allow large C&I customers, commercial industrial customers, to make their own investments in efficiency, and that's across fuels. The state energy management program allows the state to lead by example. It established a revolving loan fund so the state can make significant investments in energy efficiency and renewable energy, again, across fuels, and then pay back the loan fund and then make new investments going forward. Then finally, the Agency of Natural Resources has promulgated rules to reduce the emissions releases from above ground storage tanks, fuel storage tanks. On the home heating side, this means tank inspections. On the commercial side, it means bulk storage tank registration and regulation that leads to stopping the releases of emissions before they happen. I think back to you for the next slide, Heidi.
Okay, thanks, TJ. So our third largest sector is agriculture, which has approximately 12% of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. Emissions in this sector, again, include emissions from animal populations, crop types, and soil data. Current actions to reduce emissions include conservation practices such as cover cropping and nutrient management, also support for on-farm anaerobic digesters, and state and federal farmland conservation practices that include additional cover cropping and crop rotation. During the next Climate Council meeting, the Department of Agriculture, Food and Markets will provide a comprehensive overview of their climate change mitigation work, so stay tuned. And the next sector is electricity. And once again, I hand the baton to you, TJ.
Thank you. So the electric sector is arguably the sector where we've made the most progress on greenhouse gas emissions. And as a reminder, the electric sector emissions in the inventory are based on utility power supply purchases that are adjusted by the sales and purchases of renewable energy credits, or RECs. And what RECs are the accounting of the environmental attributes of electricity, and it's also how compliance with tiers 1 and 2 of the renewable energy standard are measured. If you think about a power supply purchase, it comes with a lot of products. One is the kilowatt hours, the energy over time. One is the kilowatt is another product that you get from a power purchase, which is the amount of purchase at the peak time. Another attribute is another product is the environmental attribute that's associated with the purchase. Those products can either be bundled or they can be separated. And what the renewable energy standard does, it says you need to retire a certain amount of these environmental attributes, the RECs, to prove you've met the requirement. And so that doesn't have to be bundled in most cases. And so you can, for example, sell the attributes associated with the McNeil plant into a Connecticut market and repurchase renewable energy attributes, the RECs, from a different generation station to meet the res. So with that type of accounting and how that applies to the inventory, I think Peter and Colin mentioned this, that in 2016, electricity accounted for over 8% of the greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont, but then the renewable energy standard took effect in 2017. We immediately saw a drop in the forecasted data. And then in 2018, estimates show that the sector contribution is going to be around 2% to our total state's emissions. So region-wide, Vermont participates in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is the regional cap and invest program for generators across the Northeast. Total emissions from large electric generators are capped, and generators are required to purchase emissions allowances from states, costs of which are then passed through into what they charge for electricity. In Vermont, the revenues from those purchases are combined with other revenues to fund those thermal efficiency programs, the RCI sector programs I talked about, that are delivered by Efficiency Vermont and Burlington Electric Department. Speaking of those efficiency utilities, Vermont has a really long history of being a leader in investing in electric efficiency as a core component of least cost planning. So by all accounts, this is a huge success story in Vermont. We estimate that the electric efficiency programs have lowered electric consumption over the past couple of decades by approximately 17% relative to what the consumption would otherwise be. As we move forward, though, traditional electric efficiency potential remains out there to be acquired, but not in the quantities that existed previously. We've actually transformed some lighting and other electric markets to where efficient products are now the baseline. So these programs have begun to evolve. Just this year, Vermont has become one of the first states to explicitly measure and compensate performance based on greenhouse gas emissions reductions that are achieved by our efficiency programs. And connected with this, Efficiency Vermont's going to be piloting a refrigeration management program which leverages their position going in, getting energy savings from commercial customers to also reduce emissions leaks from those same systems. And those are leaks of the gases that Colin were talking about that have really high global warming potential, many times greater than carbon dioxide. So that the programs are recognizing that, electric efficiency potential is not growing as it used to. We've achieved a lot of it, and we're evolving to tackle problems of our time. Efficiency Vermont's also going into that end. They're also leveraging its efficiency programs while they're in the building to build the ability in customer premises for the utilities to manage load, which I'll talk about a little later. Act 151 of 2020 now allows electric efficiency utilities to propose for the first time to work on transportation efficiency programs. Burlington Electric has submitted its proposal to the Commission. Efficiency Vermont is expected in January, and we imagine that those programs will start to take effect in mid-2021. Then in addition to our efficiency utility, specific wastewater treatment efficiency efforts are also made by the state. So that's all that second bullet right there for efficiency utility programs. There's a lot there, but back to the composition of that load. and tiers 1 and 2 of the renewable energy standard set the pace for Vermont's electric sector renewability. Tier 1 up to 75% renewable by 2032, as I said earlier. And these credits can come from the generating units around New England or even in neighboring control areas such as Hydro-Quebec can count towards Tier 1. Tier 2, as I mentioned earlier, 10% by 2032. Those must come from generating units that are smaller, less than 5 megawatts, located in Vermont and built after 2015, so newer units. Supporting programs here include net metering in the standard offer program. As you probably know, net metering allows customers to produce their own energy, to be compensated for that production. This is a pretty major program that gets a lot of attention. The standard offer program consists of an annual solicitation by the Public Utility Commission for renewable energy generation up to 2.2 megawatts. But because the renewable energy standard sets the pace of renewable requirements, these programs really dictate which types of renewable generation utilities must use for a portion of the requirement, but don't impact the requirement itself in most cases, or for the most part, then create directly emissions reductions that might be reflected in the inventory. They fall within those tiers 1 and 2 of the standard, and don't, for instance, if a standard offer plant isn't built, then the utility will still need to retire renewable energy credits and meet their requirement with another renewable resource. And so it is really just a direction on which types of renewable electricity get used to meet the standard. And finally, with electrification measures discussed in the RCI sector, it's important to recognize the supporting policy of load management. So we electrify with electric vehicles, heat pumps, commercial applications, and increase the amount of distributed generation located in Vermont. It's really critical to manage the impacts of the changes to ensure reliability, low cost of the grid. So tools like rate design, the effective use of residential and utility scale storage, and other active load management activities are being encouraged and being implemented and explored by our electric utilities. And with that, I will throw it back to you, Heidi.
Thanks, TJ. So moving along to the industrial process sector, which is 6% of our greenhouse gas emissions from the 2016 inventory. Main emissions, again, from the sector are from ozone-depleting substances alternatives and from the semiconductor manufacturing industry. Greenhouse gases from this sector include HFCs, PFCs, SF6, and F3, which have high global warming potential and often long atmospheric lifetimes. So state actions include efforts to reduce emissions of these chemicals, again, of HFCs, of PFCs, perfluorochemicals, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. One example of a mitigation measure is the recently adopted HFC rule. It was adopted this month, actually. And its intent is to phase out HFCs in use in air conditioners, refrigeration equipment, aerosol propellants, and foam end uses. The waste sector includes emissions from solid waste and wastewater. Actions to reduce emissions are focused on methane emissions reductions and include the state's universal recycling law. It also includes landfill gas to energy projects, as well as anaerobic digesters at wastewater treatment plants. And then TJ will discuss the next slide on fossil fuels.
Right, so the fossil fuel industry is the smallest tracked contributor to greenhouse gas emissions at just 0.1% of our estimated greenhouse gas emissions. This is the emissions associated with the Vermont gas infrastructure and distribution network. And Vermont Gas is required to and does conduct leak patrols and fixes all known leaks, no matter of the size, regularly surveying their lines. The Department of Public Service conducts inspections during and after construction of major work. That is it. We don't have a lot of fossil fuel industry in Vermont, so that is it for that slide.
Okay. So that completes our review of each sector. And to summarize, again, transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Vermont. And emissions from the RCI and agriculture sectors are also significant. There are existing state programs to reduce emissions in each sector, with a focus on some of the largest sectors or historically larger sectors. And it is challenging to distinguish or isolate the impact of one program to reduce emissions within an overall sector. So we're going to focus on sequestration for a moment. As noted previously, sequestration is an important mitigation strategy that is included with estimates of forest soil carbon in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Ali Koshiba from the Department of Forests and Parks will discuss this topic comprehensively during the next Climate Council meeting. But briefly, the current focus is on increasing carbon sequestration and storage in forests, as well as avoiding additional emissions from forests. And again, we include estimates of forest carbon sequestration as part of the information in our annual greenhouse gas emissions inventory. Agricultural sequestration is not yet included in this estimate since it is not yet fully quantified, although this is an active area of work. So we know sequestration happens beyond the forest, and carbon sequestration in general land use is another very important area of mitigation. Although currently carbon sequestration, again, on agricultural lands is not quantified, but the department is actively working on this process. And some existing agricultural conservation practices, such as low and no-till practices to increase carbon sequestration on agricultural lands. So that's the main focus currently. Also, other carbon sequestration programs and policies, such as efforts to limit soil erosion, in addition to the work done currently in forests, is another example of the type of sequestration actions that are not currently fully quantified. And again, the state's working to develop this data, but more work is needed. So again, would really like to highlight that this is not an exhaustive list, and that clearly there are other land use practices that could be included here. And we're working to include and expand data in these areas. And again, we know that additional land use practices are currently avoiding additional emissions. And we really have included this information here to tease up an important discussion on additional needs. So some takeaways in conclusion. The Vermont Greenhouse Gas Emissions Inventory quantifies gross emissions of greenhouse gases. There are numerous state of Vermont programs that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and support mitigation work in the state. And while additional work is needed to fully quantify the impact of existing programs, existing work will not enable the state to reach the emission reduction requirements that are in Act 153. And also, as previously noted, additional work is needed to fully quantify sequestration and sequestration-based mitigation impacts in Vermont. So with that, we'd like to offer our gratitude to the many State of Vermont employees who contributed to the work discussed in this presentation, including Commissioner Peter Walk, Chuck Schwer, Pete LaFlemme, Brian Redmond, Neil Kamen, all from the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, Ed McNamara from the Vermont Department of Public Service, Ali Koshiba from the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation, Dan Dutcher from the Vermont Agency of Transportation, as well as Alex DePillis and Ryan Patch from the Agency of Agriculture. And with that, that wraps it up. We thank you. And again, this really was a multi-agency state collaborative effort. And thanks for your attention. And with that, does anyone have any questions? I believe there's time.
Yes, there's plenty of time for questions. So those members of the council who have questions, please raise your hand and I'll let Melissa call on folks as the hands are raised. So do any members of the council have questions, comments, feedback for Heidi and TJ?
It appears that member Catherine Dimitrick does. Sorry, Catherine.
That's okay. It's Catherine Dimitruk.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I know it can be a tongue twister. My question is related to the SHI transmission bottlenecks that we have right now, and I'm wondering how, if at all, that's impacting our ability to meet some of our renewable goals.
Well, I'll take that one, Heidi.
Yeah. Thank you.
So again, the way the inventory is tracked, it is based on our consumption as adjusted by the renewable energy credits. So although the SHIA has some local constraints, that utilities are still required to purchase a certain amount of renewable energy, and so it doesn't have that direct link. As you likely know, that one of the result of those constraints, and for folks that might not know, the northern part of the state is part of what's called the Sheffield-Highgate Exchange Interface. And from a electricity transmission perspective, there's a lot of generation in that area now and not a lot of consumption. And so what happens is the renewable generation that's there sometimes needs to be curtailed because it literally cannot get out of state, and for reliability reasons needs to be curtailed. As far as the inventory goes, though, it doesn't impact that, because the way the inventory is calculated is based on the purchases with attributes connected, and there also are efforts underway to alleviate those constraints, which might at least for a while, allow for more generation to be connected.
Great. Member Johanna Miller has a question.
It's actually less of a question and more of a comment, and a thank you to Heidi and TJ and to Peter and Colin before as well for a lot of critical context and an overview of the existing programs that we have at the state of Vermont upon which to build. So thank you for that. There's a lot going on, and I do think we can build from that solid foundation. I do think that despite all the good programs, I mean, as Colin's, greenhouse gas emission inventory showed, we're still falling far short. A long way to go and a short way to get there. I appreciate that. So I guess one thing I wanted to ask was just, I think it would be helpful to have, just a better shared understanding of where we stand to inform where we need to go. And just another request, ideally, in the next agenda where there is a window for the Energy Action Network's annual progress report overview, in part because I think it encapsulates a lot of what we just got today, but in a very accessible format. From my perspective, this is very complicated stuff, and I think getting a better sense and putting a finer point on where we stand, where we need to focus, the magnitude and sort of the scale of that. I mean, I think we heard from several folks today, transportation and our building sector is really where we need to focus. And I think the EAN analysis would do that. So that I'm just putting that in the hopper again as a request. And then also just because, I think TJ laid out, and a lot of us know we've made pretty significant progress in our electric sector. That wasn't by accident. It was by good policy design and requirements. And I think we need similar things like that in the transportation and thermal sector. essentially we need levers to pull to get to the 2025 target, the 2030 target, and the 2050 target. And to understand, 2025, I think will be ambitious but doable. The window between 2025 and 2030, I think, will be even more of a challenge. So we need to be thinking comprehensively, and I think that an EAN analysis will help. And I also think, just a request, I appreciate all of the good work that the administration, Secretary Young, so many folks have put into this process, standing this up on a short timeline. I can tell you with my work at the local level, with town energy committees and through the environmental network that I, work within, there's a lot of interest in this, partners who want to participate. And so I think we have a lot to do, and I'm looking forward to further agendas where we can unpack big ideas. Like today, I think it sounds like the Transportation and Climate Initiative, this regional program to cap emissions in the transportation sector. There's likely a final MOU that's going to be rolled out on that. Just the opportunity to dig into some of these big issues with our fellow council members. So I'm just looking forward to sort of co-creating a process that really enables us to unpack the obligation, but more so the opportunities in terms of how we rebuild out of this pandemic and put people to work and really ensure that the priorities and the perspectives and the interests of the most vulnerable are really at the table. So just another request for the EAN presentation and a little more time baked in based on all of this good work and information that we got today. So thank you so much for the time to comment.
Thank you, Johanna.
Thank you. We have 3 more hands raised. We'll start with member Sophia Clark, please. Sophia, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. You might be muted.
Can you hear me?
We can, thank you.
Oh, okay, sorry, thank you. And thank you for your presentations, all of you. I'd also like to second Johanna on the EAN progress report. And this is kind of on a side, and I know they briefly touched on it in the presentation, but I was just thinking, like, are we looking at the chemical reactions happening to like chemicals in our water systems, as well as like fossil fuels and all of this other stuff, and how it's affecting our soil health and plant health, and then our health, and how that's also possibly contributing to changes in our climate. I'm not sure if that is. I was just curious if we're like looking into that, all these different chemicals being issued into the natural world, and what we're doing about it. So like not only fossil fuels, but just other things that could interact and inhibit natural growth of plants.
Hi, Sophia, this is Heidi Hales. I could take a first approach at that and just reiterate that, the cycling of pollutants through our ecosystems is a very important part of the work that is currently done at the Department of Environmental Conservation and the agency, and also in state government. There is work being done looking at emerging and new contaminants and how they may impact environmental and public health. Again, I do know that during the next Climate Council meeting, I believe it's at January 4th, that we'll have speakers from the Departments of Agriculture, Food and Markets, as well as the Departments of Forests and Parks, and I believe Fish and Wildlife as well. So they may be able to provide some more information on programs regarding land use and sequestration of carbon and some processes that may be impacting the ability of our lands to sequester carbon. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add to that.
I think when we do a preview of the next meetings, Sophia, you'll see that we are going to be in the spirit of of providing critical context and interview and an overview, we'll be looking at some of those issues and giving you a status.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Member Sue Minter has her hand raised, please.
Good morning. Thank you. I just want to, I guess, comment quickly and then ask a question. What a tremendous presentation or series of presentations, I thank everyone. And from the National Climate Assessment 4 to its regional analysis of what is happening and what we can anticipate to then the deeper dive into our emissions inventory and where we sit today. And at the very end, where we're supposed to go as a council, the short time, big effort ahead. Now to Heidi and TJ, who have really thought a lot about what we're doing now. So I guess my question to you is, where you sit now thinking of what we currently are doing and where we are being asked to go, are there key programs that you think are critical that we utilize and fast forward? Obviously, the electric sector is making the most impact per Joey's point, but are there things completely missing? And do we need to be thinking completely differently because we are not on pace? And you've been giving this a lot of thought, and I just wanted to hear from you. As we set forward, and I know there's more to learn, but given this is your work, are there key takeaways that we should be hearing about and learning from today? Thanks.
I can just briefly start off saying I from where I sit and what I see is I believe we have some really good and strong programs in place, but even if the example that you brought up, the electrification of our light duty fleet, it's the number of electric vehicles in our light duty fleet is still quite small. It's still a small percentage of the total number of vehicles. So there's a lot more that needs to be done in that sector to really transform transportation in the state of Vermont to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So in addition to continuing to move forward with cleaning up the electricity consumption generation of greenhouse gases, I do think focusing on the transportation sectors and the RCI sectors, as well as doing what we can in the other sectors as well to really start to think about how can we really continue to move people to electrification. Those are just some of my initial thoughts. And TJ, I can tell by his screenshot, has some items he'd like to add as well.
Yeah, thanks. I'll mention two areas, I guess, and one is our low-income weatherization programs are really important, and there's still a need, and it's not just, as I mentioned earlier, on a energy basis. There's a broad need for those programs for a host of other reasons that I won't get into detail. But one of the things that I think about a lot is how do we leverage the investments that we do make as a state to get more private investment into the industry, into moving our goals. We all know that we're a small state and have limited resources, but we also know that we have to continue to move forward. And I guess to the council, if we can find ways to leverage what we invest now to get others to come into Vermont and establish new businesses and help us tackle the solution, then we're going to be in a better place.
Great, thank you. And it looks like there's one final hand raised from member Chris Campany, please.
Hi, just want to remind folks also that with the enactment of Act 174, that established energy planning standards, new ones for municipalities and regional planning commissions. And the point of that was to actually implement the state comprehensive energy plan, and then also going forward with the plan, with the state comprehensive energy plan, for those plans to actually inform the CEP's update, next update. And all of these regional energy plans and the municipal plans went through a robust public engagement process. This took place over at least a couple of years. I think it may have been a little longer than that. Each of the regional energy plans was approved by the Department of Public Service and reviewed by multiple agencies. We particularly got comments back from Agency of Natural Resources. It's been a little bit, but I think we also got it from VTrans and Agency of Commerce and Community Development. But at some point in the future, I think it'd be good for us to provide an overview of what the standards were for those regional energy plans and for the municipal energy plans, because the goal was to address greenhouse gas reduction across multiple sectors, how to improve efficiency, and how to site renewable energy to actually achieve in aggregate the goals of the state comprehensive energy plan. So a lot of work went into that, a lot of due process went into that. And again, we just encourage folk to be aware of that, and that we spend some time looking at those, because I think they'll help inform some of this conversation going forward. Also, on the resilience side of things, I know we've talked a lot about greenhouse gas emissions today, but we should also just encourage us to have a conversation about the local hazard mitigation planning process, and that those contain actionable resilience items in there. You know, identifying specific culverts that tend to cause damage or flood or get blown out, and road segments, and what areas of communities flood, where you have not only flooding risk but also fluvial erosion risk. And it gets into all hazards, not just flooding, but that's a big one that we're going to be dealing with. So just wanted to make that point.
Great, thank you, Chris.
Secretary, if I might just add on to what Member Campany just mentioned there. One, thank you for raising those Act 174 required reports, requirements. I think that was a big part of our energy plan process, and as we go forward, will continue to be a big part. And engaging and having the data that communities can actually use to plan going forward is going to be critical. And you brought up resilience, and that reminded me of another item to add on to my response to Member Minter's question is one thing that can help facilitate our move forward with electrification and other members is broadband expansion, and allowing access to the entire state to take advantage of these services that are being offered. I mentioned load management, and broadband's a really critical part of active load management and having customers be able to help in the response and manage the electric grid. So I just want to throw that out there as well.
Okay, well, thank you, Melissa. Is there anyone else with their hand raised?
There's a member from the public with their hand raised.
Okay, well, we can take the comment in the public comment period, which is coming up. I know, Johanna, in the note that you had an issue with your hand raising function, so I'm asking all the other members if there's anyone who's been unable to raise their hands, please, if you speak now or turn on your camera and wave your hand, we'll make sure you get an opportunity to participate. So if there's anyone in that situation, we'll give you a minute to do that.
Member Abby Corse has her hand raised.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to comment again, thank you so much for all of the incredible information that's been presented today. I do just want to ensure that we are thinking that we are approaching these issues holistically. I'm I'm really interested in hearing about some of the things that we don't hear about so often. So what is the impact of transportation in regards to the way that our education system has been set up, in the ways that our rural communities have slowly had resources taken away from them, and in the educational capacity, particularly when I think about the driving that I do now versus the driving my parents did, when I think about food systems and the resilience that communities used to have in regards to their food systems and the way that that impacts greenhouse gas emissions, I understand the push and the desire to talk about electrification, and I understand the statistics and the need to talk about those things. But I also think that siloing off our issues in those ways doesn't always allow us to tune into the solutions that are very accessible and very are equitable and actually do service the communities on the ground. And I deeply look forward to the coming meetings when hopefully we can talk a little bit more broadly about these, the greater impact and the ways that we can think about these systems more broadly. Thank you.
Okay, those are great points, Abby. If there are no other members, I think, we'll cover a little bit of this in just a broad conversation about the next meeting and beyond, subcommittees, and what is the level of detail we as a council should get into, and what is the level of detail and where should we park, many of these issues in subcommittees that we think are going to have the more robust technical and other conversations, bringing them up to the council. But again, this is over January. I think it's our hope, the administration's hope anyway, that by the end of the month, we'd be able to break into subcommittees and sort out in the coming days and weeks what's best, for the subcommittees to address and the whole council to address. So with that, are there any other members? We can move right into that conversation of next meetings if you're ready. Okay. The next meeting, we thank you all for responding to Melissa's scheduling request and surveys. And it looks like Mondays really are the day that work best for the 23 members of the council. So we've scheduled a second meeting, the third meeting for January 4, 2021 at the same time, same place. And we have an agenda preview that I'll turn over to Secretary Moore. Before I do, I think there's a lot of good feedback that's coming out of these meetings. And the next meeting, as I mentioned earlier, is hopefully to continue and perhaps complete, if not, we'll see, the broad overview on the inventories and what we're doing now, because if we don't know where we've been, it's hard to know where to go, right? So I'm learning an awful lot from this. I am not an expert in any of these fields, and I hope others are finding this helpful. If you think there are other topics or areas that you don't see being addressed in the next agenda or the one after that, feel free to send Melissa your ideas, and then we can, take those into consideration and maybe fit those into subcommittee meetings or fit those into the broader meeting. It's just, there's so much information. It's hard to know, when to take the deep dive or not. So for now, I guess I'll turn it over to Secretary Moore if she wants to give a preview of what we're thinking about the next agenda and possibly the agenda after that, which is on, we'll get to that, establishing a regular meeting date in the next item.
Great. Thank you, Secretary Young. I have endeavored to share my screen, and hopefully folks can see that with a draft agenda for January 4th. Obviously, Joey, we've heard your feedback today, as well as some additional requests, and we'll look at how we might integrate the EAN presentation, but this was the proposal going into it. I think the pieces to highlight would first be a presentation from Susanna Davis about equity considerations. And then there are a couple of other sort of statutory pieces where we're envisioning there would be presentations similar to those made today. One focused on existing programs to build resilience, and then one focused on natural and working lands. And I think that would get at some of the questions potentially Sophia raised, in that it would cover both our forest-based assets as well as our agricultural lands. And similar to today, we have time designated on the agenda for organizational needs and updates. Would then just flip quickly to the draft agenda for later in the month. This one is much draftier than the January 4th agenda, but part of it would be then as we think about how we actually want to organize and do our work. And this very much aligns with the comments Secretary Young made in terms of thinking about what level of conversations we want to have as a council and what level of conversations we want to have in these subcommittees. But to bring in some representatives from other states that have gone through similar planning exercises and benefit from their experience and how they've organized themselves, and frankly, also hoping to hear what they would do different if they had to do it over again. And then spend the bulk of that third meeting, or that fourth meeting, excuse me, talking about council organizational structure. So as I say, that one's really drafty. I've done some initial outreach to different folks who might be willing to be part of that panel. Have gotten confirmation from the U.S. Climate Alliance that they are interested and available to participate, and I'm waiting to hear back from others. But just know that this is the direction we're headed, with, as I said, some additional detail available for the January 4th agenda. And with that, Secretary Young, I'm happy to turn it back over to you, or if you want, take additional thoughts and feedback.
I mean, if folks have immediate thoughts and feedback, feel free to comment now. See if any hands go up on this one. Okay. The next item in the organizational updates is to establish a regular meeting date and time. As the Assistant Attorney General mentioned to us, by statute, we should establish a regular meeting date and time, and that way it will get on the public meetings schedule as a regular meeting, and folks in the public and others who are following along will know when we plan to meet on a regular basis. This doesn't foreclose having special meetings around the regular meeting. And again, going back to the responses to Melissa's work, it looks like Mondays work well for the group. And so looking ahead on the calendars, I would like everyone to think about whether the fourth Monday of the month moving forward works for everybody, and we can take that up as an item on January 4. But I wanted to put that out there. We're proposing to begin the regular meetings on January 25 and then throughout the year. And I think we'll be missing most holidays that fall on a Monday if we make it the fourth Monday. It's not perfect, but it seems to be one that will not be interrupted by Monday holidays for most of the year. So I'll just leave that for all to think about, and if it's doesn't work for you, again, if you could let Melissa know, she'll let us know, and we'll make it a discussion item though for January 4. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has initial comments or questions. Great. So Secretary Moore wanted to give everyone an update on staff recruitment.
Sure. So as we shared at the last meeting, we did have a job description that went out related to the Global Warming Solutions Act project manager. This is one of 3 positions we'll ultimately be adding at ANR. We received more than 30 applications for the job, and over the last week conducted an initial round of interviews of 10 different individuals. We're in the process of winnowing that to a list of finalists, and hope to be in a position to have selected a final applicant by the week of January 4th, with the very lofty ambition of having somebody in place by the end of January. We know that having this dedicated staff capacity is really essential given the aggressive nature of the schedule. And so I've been moving apace to do that. As you may recall, the other two positions provided for in the Global Warming Solutions Act are a program technician. Our hope is to have that job announcement posted early in the new year, but have the project manager in place by the time it comes to consider potential candidates so that they can be actively involved in those decisions. And then the final position is a legal resource. And while important to the overall work, that need becomes most pressing as we get closer to the rulemaking phase of the Global Warming Solutions Act scope. And so anticipate that we'll be looking to hire that position probably later this spring. And happy to pause there and take any questions that folks might have about where we stand in the hiring process.
Member Sue Minter has her hand raised, please.
Hi, just a quick question about sort of public engagement as you've envisioned that. Somehow I did hear there might be a specific person or role devoted to that. And given that I'm, representing low-income Vermonters, I am thinking a lot about strategies for enhanced engagement, and I wondered when that might be relevant to discuss.
Sure, that's a great question, and actually is a nice segue into the next two bullets under the organizational updates, both the role for a facilitator and a draft request for information. In addition to the resources provided in the Global Warming Solutions Act for these staff positions at ANR, as well as some of the administrative costs of the council, the legislature specifically identified contractor services to support communication and outreach. And so that is absolutely a piece of an important component and conversation that needs to be had. Having talked to colleagues in Maine at some length, they indicated that they had actually engaged the services of a professional facilitator that had both worked with the council on sort of process design questions about their own work and the structure in terms of what kind of tasks were taken on by the subcommittees versus the role of the council itself. As well as helping them plan and organize an overall communications and outreach strategy. So put that out there for folks' consideration. The other piece is while the legislature explicitly called out the communications and outreach components of the work that need to be done and contractor support that may be required to achieve those goals, I do believe that there are other components of this work where we're going to actively need to engage a contractor to do some of the detailed technical analysis and scenario building to look at different approaches for not just what the types of policy measures are, but how we would actually implement them and at what level. And so we have been preparing a draft request for information to get at some of the technical support services as well. So there's sort of a couple of pieces there, I guess, Sue, in response to your question. One is thinking about that role of a facilitator and how they may help us have a really robust public outreach and engagement process. I think that that's going to be essential to our work. And frankly, and have some concerns about the timeline that we have to do the work and the ability to have a genuine and thoughtful outreach process, but then also sort of the bigger needs that the council will have in terms of contractor support and how we make sure that we're well positioned and have the resources available to answer the really important questions that are being asked. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question or more just an explanation that we're also thinking very much in that space.
Thank you. That's about what I understand, and it was helpful to hear your thinking and to have a little more detail there. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Johanna has her real hand up.
I'm so sorry. It's not showing up. My apologies.
Okay, it happens.
Thank you, Secretary Moore, for that overview and what is clearly like some good thinking and commitment to the process component. I guess one thing I'm wondering about, or how are you thinking about is sort of the role of the council members who bring expertise that could be partners in some of that process, and like, you know, that just the data foundation and everything else, just trying to think about how we can add, you know, add value to that, and all the different folks that were appointed, you know, by the Speaker and the Senate. I don't know if you're thinking about that or if that's something we can brainstorm more together, but clearly there's a lot of expertise on the council itself, and how that plays out is just a question.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I think there's both expertise and frankly capacity, just how much time people are going to be able to dedicate to the work of the council, and trying to get our arms around that and just develop a process or design a process that's meaningful for everyone. Having talked to folks in several other states at this point, oftentimes the council ends up serving sort of a plenary function, where a lot of the nuts and bolts and detailed work is done at the subcommittee level and then is reported back to the council. I'm not sure if that structure is right for us, but I feel like that's the work we really need to engage in in the meeting on the 25th, to think about how we want to, what process we actually want to use. I think the remote format is challenging in and of itself right now, but the large group remote format is extra challenging. The other piece that we haven't talked about yet, that the legislature left the door open to in the way the act is structured, is the ability to bring in additional stakeholders to the subcommittee process. We're not limited to the council members themselves. I think that may be an important tool for bringing in some of the interests that aren't maybe fully or at all represented in the current council structure, much to the point, for example, that Abby raised this morning regarding the Abenaki participation. And so, you know, I sort of, there is a lot of options and opportunities to structure this different ways. And I guess I sort of feel like a facilitator could provide real value in helping us work through a process design that tries to create space for both breadth and depth of conversations that I think could be challenging to have in this large group format, but still ultimately have the action plan benefit from that more detailed work.
I think that's a nice transition into the last topic, which is the subcommittee overview, and I did ask Melissa to pull the slide from the last meeting and post it for us if she's ready to, just so we can reorient ourselves to what the statutory subcommittees are, get people thinking about what time commitment do you have to make to subcommittee work, if that is your interest and you have capacity. What types of expertise would we want to bring in on each of those subcommittees? And indeed, do we want to add I'm not advocating for adding more subcommittees, but do we have a need as we go through these next two meetings of overviews and input? Do we need to create another subcommittee? And there's that option in the statute. So this is a slide from the last meeting, and just to remind everybody what the subcommittee structure looks like in the statute. There's the Rural Resilience Subcommittee, and this is basically the statutory language of the focus of each of these committees. There you go, Melissa. It's good there. So rural will focus on the pressure that the climate change adaptation will impose on rural transportation, electricity, housing, emergency services, and communications infrastructure, and the difficulty of rural communities in meeting the needs of its citizens. The cross-sector mitigation subcommittee is focusing on identifying, and maybe this is to your point, Johanna, or Abby, focus on identifying the most scientifically and technologically feasible strategies and programs that will result in the largest possible greenhouse gas emission reductions in the most cost-effective manner. That's a huge focus. Just Transition Subcommittee, again, to your point, Abby, will be focusing on ensuring that our strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and build resilience will adapt to the effects of climate change, benefit and support all residents of the state fairly and equitably. and then the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. And again, a pretty lengthy focus, and I'll let you all read that yourselves. But those are the four that we, are hoping to have stood up with expertise, with balance, with council members to the extent that they feel that they can engage in subcommittee work. Although, I don't see that as a mandatory for those on the council who just, may not have the time to spend in subcommittees, which may be meeting more frequently initially than the council itself. So that's the, I'm done with that slide, Melissa, if you want to take it down, and then we can open it up to a little more conversation.
Suzanne, if I might add one thing here, just in terms of other subcommittees, which is one of the things I had heard from very clearly from Maine, is that they had I think they called it Science and Data Subcommittee, but really a very technically oriented committee that worked on some of the essentially some of the modeling questions about greenhouse gas emissions reductions and the book of work that was going to be required to achieve the goals or the requirements that were established in statute, and evaluate different scenarios. And I wonder if that's something that doesn't have a role here, sort of a technical home, as opposed to some of the pieces that have been laid out explicitly in the act itself.
Anyone else on the council with Melissa? Maybe
Yep.
Perhaps watch the hands.
Yes. Yep. Member Dupany Giroux has her hand raised, please.
Thank you, Melissa. I just wanted to respond to Secretary Moore's last question. I know for a fact that the Maine state climatologists and some members of the U.S. Geological Survey were part of that data analysis team and provided a lot of sort of deep dive into the science upon which everything else was built. So I think it would be a great idea to have something similar for us to kind of move forward.
Anybody else? If we're not seeing your hand, speak up now if you're a member of the council. And Johanna?
I don't want to speak too much, but I guess one thing I'm just thinking about, just to put it out there so that we can all brainstorm together, is I know it's baked into the law that council members can avail themselves of a per diem. We are not traveling right at this moment, but I have the privilege of doing this work professionally by day, and I guess what I'm interested in thinking about is how we make it possible for people who are doing a lot of other things, but whose perspectives we need in the subcommittee structure to, potentially, financially enable them to participate and inform this process. So I don't know if that's, I'm happy to give the per diem. I don't know if I can do that. I guess I want to just put it out there that I'd love to think with you all and potentially with others about how we can make it just feasible to ensure that we have the expertise that Abby and others are noting is going to be really critical, especially in the, in all of this, but in the Just Transitions subcommittee in particular.
Johanna, thank you so much for saying that. I would just like to say, as a lay member of the council, that is something that I feel is not regularly enough taken into account. It comes at a personal expense for me to do this work, and I believe that I hold the privilege to do that as a person who belongs to a multi-generational farm family and owns our land outright. I feel strongly that I need to be here to represent the interests of the voices that can't be here, but I do think that that is definitively something that we need to be considering as we move through this work deeply, is that I am not paid to be here. I am hardly paid, period. So, those types of things factor in, and it doesn't, simply because your job title, comes with a salary or doesn't, or whatever, doesn't mean that your expertise isn't valid. And I really appreciate that point, Johanna. Thank you.
I think it's an excellent point as well, and we should incorporate it into our thinking and our conversations as we move forward with subcommittees and with council meetings, and access to these meetings by members of the public. At least the one thing that the pandemic has done is made us far more accessible to the members of the public by posting our meetings and live streaming when we can. But it doesn't address your issue, Abby, which is, should we be thinking about different times for the meetings, or I don't know, I've mentioned it before, and maybe Maine can help us out if they're able to join us. They did a series of webinars as part of their council meetings, with mandatory webinars that you could do on your own time versus live meetings. So I think we need to talk creatively and think creatively around that, and maybe we can get some counsel from Maine as well as to what worked, what didn't work. Anybody else on the council? Okay. Again, like I said, if you have thoughts over the next week or so before the January 4 meeting, perhaps send them to Melissa, and we can try to kind of recap them all and talk about them on January 4 at the beginning or the end of the meeting, because I think lots of good points and thoughts today. Well, with that, we move into, unless I'm missing anything, the public comment period of the meeting. If there are members of the public who would like to comment, please raise your hand. We will have Melissa go through those whose hands are raised and try to give everybody sufficient time to comment. So right now I see 3 hands. So Melissa, would you want to?
Certainly. We'll start with Robert Lemert, please. And you are muted. If you're speaking, we can't hear you.
I think we have 4 folks with their hands raised that I can tell. So I think if folks could limit themselves to 3 minutes so we can get through everybody. And then when we have additional time, we can circle back to those who may have more to say. So Mr. Lemert.
You're still on mute, Mr. Lemert.
Christ's sakes.
There we go. Now we can hear you. Thank you.
That's that.
We can hear you now.
Fine. This is for Secretary Moore. Ryan Patch's presentation showed the goals that are required by the law as far as reduction of greenhouse gases. And I need to pull that slide up really quickly. This is on slide 20 of Secretary Walk's presentation, and it shows the total emissions trends and goals. And the goal stated here is a 26% reduction below 2005 levels by 2025. And the most recent data, which is shown here, appears to be 2016. And the inventories will lag the current date. I mean, they're not instantaneous. They take a number of years to compile exactly where we stand. So if the law requires a goal by 2025, 26% reduction, will that be reported to the legislature on January 1st, 2025, or December 31st, 2025, or will that require a lag in order to compile data?
It will require a lag to compile the data. I think generally the data, in part because we're relying on work done by EPA after the year closes to which pulls from all of the states in the region. But generally, we're looking at a 2 to 3 year lag. We are able to do some forecasting, and that was included in Colin Smythe's presentation, where he previewed where we believe we're headed for 2017 and 2018 in the final table he shared. But those aren't, I would describe those as preliminary data. And so that they are still being worked on and refined. I think that probably is going to be a challenge we'll need to wrestle with in terms of how ultimately we're going to view our success and when we're likely to know. In addition, frankly, to some of the other issues that I think folks did an excellent job flagging today about what is and isn't included in the emissions inventory, and how that aligns with the work the council wants to see move forward.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. It's good to know. Main comment that I wanted to make was in respect to the sole use of a biogenic item, pretty much the sole use of a biogenic item in the inventory, and that's basically it's forest carbon. Forest carbon is generally in a healthy forest, excluding afforestation or reforestation, soil carbon will be essentially level and not change very much. Although I do want to point out that in the West, there are many states where forest carbon has declined to a point where it is now a net emitter. So we shouldn't take carbon sequestration within a forest context to be a given. It's not it lacks permanence in that it is primarily what's known, and many of you may be familiar with the term labile carbon. It is subject to degradation by microorganisms and has a mean residency, which could be estimated to be in decades or perhaps as much as a century. But after that, that carbon is going to basically be back in the atmosphere. So it is it's sort of a checking account. The carbon goes in, the carbon comes out. But in general, in a natural system, it will balance. Labile carbon can be supplemented by a form of carbon which is recalcitrant. And in fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2018, October 2018, published guidelines for pyrogenic recalcitrant carbon, which has a residency of hundreds, centuries, or millennia. And my point basically is that if something happened to our forests where we started seeing drought, insect kill, or for some reason we stopped being able to maintain our forest carbon, that carbon would be released into the atmosphere. But I wanted to point out that it's the only item in the inventory which is biogenic in nature as opposed to anthropogenic. And there is an anthropogenic, there are several anthropogenic ways to generate carbon sequestration.
Mr. Lieber, thank you for that point. We have a number of members of the public who would like.
I'm sure you do, and I've enjoyed the last 4 hours waiting to make my comment. Yeah. I hope it's been useful.
Well, we also will have sufficient time, perhaps in the subcommittees to get this deeply into those issues. And also there's always the opportunity to email us your remarks, and we'll make sure that they are a part of the public record. So again, we'll move on to Mr. Bender.
Yes, thank you very much for the presentations today, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm president of Solar Effect Energy in Norwich, Vermont, and given that 82% of our energy use is not electric, I think our assumptions about the electric sector are really critical, because electrification is clearly a major part of solving climate change. So first of all, Hydro-Quebec is not carbon-free. It's about half of our energy use in Vermont. Professor Hager, professor of earth sciences in MIT, has analyzed the peer-reviewed literature, and he concludes about half of the production of Hydro-Quebec is on the same order of greenhouse gas emissions as natural gas. They're some of the dirtiest hydro dams on the planet because they tend to be shallow and have flooded forests. Second, no one else claims renewability. If Vermont was stuck to Apple standards, we're not renewable. If we stuck to Google standards, we're not renewable. Green-E, the largest renewable certification agency in the country, we're not renewable. 5 other New England states do not allow Hydro-Quebec RECs to count as renewable. We're the only state that allows that, so we can buy them really cheap, so we can pretend we're renewable. And third is common sense. If you think, if I saw the graphs correctly, it showed that we reduced carbon in the electric sector by about 3/4 in the last 2 years. And that is only by paper. And so nuclear doesn't change. The amount of Hydro-Quebec production doesn't change. The New England hydro that's 100 years old doesn't change. So all we're doing is shuffling pieces of paper around, and we're feeling good, but we're not actually addressing climate change. And in comparison, or in contrast, if you actually build some solar facilities, you are reducing carbon because that electricity is largely fixed. The nuclear, the hydro is fixed. You add more solar electrons into the grid and you're reducing emissions from natural gas. And certainly if we have electrification at the margin, right now we have to consider at the margin, it's all going to be natural gas. And finally, my last point is a charge of the council is resilience. And I think it's hard to argue that hydro dams 800 miles away provide Vermont the same level of resilience as energy production in the state. So I'd really like the council to seriously look at some of the assumptions about the electricity sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bender. I believe we have Matt Coda up next.
Yes, thank you. My name is Matt Coda. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association. I represent the hundreds of local businesses and the thousands of working Vermonters that keep fuel flowing through the state. Our members sell both thermal and transportation fuels, heating oil, kerosene, bioheat, diesel, off-road diesel, biodiesel, chunk wood, wood pellets, coal, propane, natural gas, even electrons for electric vehicles. We also provide technical training and regulatory assistance for these companies, and we also train the majority of heating technicians throughout the state as our member companies sell and install burners, boilers, furnaces, stoves, geothermal, and electric air source heat pumps. Full disclosure, I applied for the fuel sector position on the Climate Council because I think I can provide a holistic view on how these fuels are distributed around the state and how individual energy companies engage with their customers and how it might affect the Climate Council, which I think is important for the discussion. The Speaker of the House didn't see it that way. That's okay. It's not the first volunteer job I didn't get. Probably won't be the last. However, I would like to publicly thank the Speaker of the House for not leaving the fuel sector seat vacant following the resignation of Michael Schmel. I'm confident that Brian Gray of Vermont Energy Co-op, who the Speaker has chosen to replace Michael, will provide information about the ongoing effort by the oil heat industry to transform into a full services, energy services model, and our effort in the oil heat industry to sell renewable liquid fuels. But keep in mind that the fuel sector is not just heating oil. In fact, it represents about 15% of the fossil fuels that we sell in the state. Gasoline, diesel fuel, off-road diesel for farms, propane represent more than 80% of the fuel flowing through the state. I intend to participate in these meetings as much as possible as I can as a member of the public to provide the perspective of the working Vermonters that sell these fuels and to support the work of Vermonters that are out in the snow today, making sure all of us are warm in our homes. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you for letting us know that there has been an appointment by the speaker. I don't think I have seen that as of today, but we'll make sure that we get Mr. Gray. Is Mr. Gray on board with an email account and notice of the meeting? So thank you.
Great. Thank you.
I think our final public comment is from Donna Laban.
Hi, yes, my name's Donna Laban, and I'm here as a private citizen, but also representing architects and the design portion of the construction industry. I am a member of the Public Policy Committee at AIA Vermont, and I report back pretty much on what the committee's doing and also offer our expertise on the building sector areas of climate action. The only comments I really wanted to make are about concurrent efforts of the legislature that are intended to support the work of climate action. Bills have been introduced, a very important one dealing with building contractor registration. TJ Poor did a good job kind of outlining the broad scale of work at his department, and mentioned the energy code issue, which which kind of touches on the climate action from the energy efficiency standpoint. But building contractor registration is important for a number of reasons, and that is that we don't really know who they are. We have no way of directing, or the state has no way of directing its efficiency and all of its building-oriented programs to contractors, and so therefore there's a big gap in education between those builders and contractors who do participate in Efficiency Vermont programs and educate themselves, and the majority of them that don't. There's a lot of them out there, so please support building contractor registration when it comes up in the legislature this year. It's a very important thing to be able to meet your building, residential particularly, goals. Architects and engineers are licensed, so anything that goes through an architect or engineer is very likely to meet whatever legislated and code related issues are put out there. But there's also a big issue with compliance. The energy codes and any kind of regulated building compliance is based on the industry is actually following those codes. And right now there's, particularly in the residential area, there's a big lack of compliance, even with the ever increasing requirements of the code. So just want to make everybody aware that we have great codes. Those have been updated and legislated, but the enforcement of those is very much lacking. So let's make sure that we don't assume things are happening when we don't have the structure in the state to actually make that happen. And I thank you very much for your work. I expect to be following it, and thanks very much for the opportunity to say a few words.
Well, thank you for participating. We've reached the end of our agenda and our time for today. And if there are members of the public who weren't comfortable commenting today, we're always happy to take email or written comments. We will have a public comment period at the end of every meeting as well. And I'm sure the subcommittees, for those who want to get into the really technical aspects, will also be open meetings subject to public comment as well. So, and again, to member Minter's observation, we are working on the communications plan. There are a lot of interest across the state in this topic and in the work of the council, and we will be as transparent and as open to the public as we possibly can be. With that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Okay. All in favor, please say aye.
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 Anyone opposed? Okay, well, great. Well, we'll see you. Happy holidays to everybody. We'll see you next year on January 4, bright and early in the new year. So stay healthy and happy, and we will see you then. Bye-bye.
Sure.